The biggest criminals in the world have banking licenses of their own. They don't need to money launder. They own HSBC and that money launders for them. Keep in mind, this isn't a matter of evil people doing evil things. This is a matter of systemic corruption. And know your government. Guess what? They're funding the war criminals. They're funding the terrorists. They're paying the arms dealers. And they're doing it using the banking system that they're supposedly doing oversight on. There will always be criminal activity. That's part of society. Changing the way money works only ends up punishing the innocent. If the government can watch everything you do, if they can watch every time you spend money, their ability to control your behavior is enormous. And it will put people at the mercy of a system in which, at a flick of a binary switch, you can become a non-person. Went to the wrong website, attended the wrong protests, associated with the wrong political party, expressed support for the wrong idea, off. You no longer exist. That's scenario A. Scenario B is a world in which we have a fully connected economy using a form of currency that is neutral, transparent, global, and open, belonging to everyone, requiring no qualification to enter or access the system, and not under the control of any government or bank. That's what Bitcoin offers.
This week on the show, we have Andreas Antonopoulos, one of the most well-respected figures in the world when it comes to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. He spends 365 days a year traveling the world, talking about this technology. He's been on the Joe Rogan Experience 4 different times. It was great welcoming him back into the studios. And I love Andreas because he's so passionate about this technology and he's so selfless. He could be the CEO of some company when it comes to this type of money, but instead, he goes around and just educates the people, and his passion, it's palpable, and he is the best person when it comes to actually explaining how this technology is gonna implicate you and me as humans in the next 20 years. And again, this is not just about money. This is about how we actually communicate with each other as human beings. And he believes the idea of a sovereign currency, whether it be dollars or pound or yen or euros, it's gonna soon be a thing of the past the way that sovereign airlines used to be a thing of the past. And then someday we're actually gonna have these currencies like Bitcoin and other things where we can have our own privacy when it comes to our commerce. And this is a really important point here. A lot of people are very protective of their privacy online, but when it comes to their privacy of their spending habits, they seem to trust these things to the credit card companies and the banks, when in fact this is the most important information about you. And we can protect that information by adopting cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin sooner than later. And let's be honest, money is one of the ways we actually communicate with each other as humans. We value people based on the transactions and the commerce that we make. And so it's really an essential human right, having our privacy and freedom to spend as we wish. And Andreas talks about this. We got really personable about what it's like to be him, the struggles that he has as a human being, what it's like to really be living out of a suitcase, and how he finds it very free to get rid of all the things in his life. You know, you don't need things, you don't need an apartment and a flat to really feel whole. And in a way, by getting rid of that stuff, you actually get closer to the human experience. So I know you're gonna enjoy this episode very much. The live episode was watched by thousands of people around the world. And so sit back and enjoy what we have to tell you about Andreas. And if you want to watch more episodes just like this, they're all available for free inside the London Real Academy. You can go to londonreal.tv, and also inside, I have a team of people that are going through our Life Accelerator program. We are accelerating their lives in 6 weeks. and I am teaching them everything I've learned from the last 5 years of the greatest minds coming to London Real Studios. And we are upgrading everything about their lives, their mindfulness, their diets, their movement practices, their mindset, their relationships, and we're giving them a plan for 2017 to crush their year. So that's happening inside. Come on in, say hi, and take a look. And now I leave you with the king of Bitcoin, Mr. Andreas Antonopoulos. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Andreas Antonopoulos, one of the most well-known and respected figures in the world of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. You travel the world 365 days per year, proselytizing the benefits of the blockchain, and have appeared no less than 4 times on the Joe Rogan Experience. Your latest book, The Internet of Money, explains in detail why Bitcoin matters. Andreas, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun last time, I had to come back.
Love having you here. Our audience loves you. I think the internet loves you for a good reason, because you're spreading a valuable message. Bitcoin just hit $750. My British pound is dropping in value, going in the toilet. What should I do? What is going on with the world?
Well, what's going on with the world is that the system of central banking is now experiencing a worldwide crisis that's completely unprecedented. It's never happened before. You have, I think, about $25 trillion of bonds that are now negative yield, several interest rates that are negative, and dozens of central banks around the world, currency crisis after currency crisis.
Right, and negative interest rates, for people that don't know, means that you give them money.
To hold your money.
To hold your money. So you pay them interest to hold your money.
Yes.
The opposite of anything we've known in the last few hundred years, or
Right.
ever, really.
Yes. In fact, orthodox economics used to say that negative interest rates are impossible and you shouldn't even approach the zero bound for very long. And yet now you have more than 20 central banks at the zero bound, some in negative interest rates. You know, I sometimes start my talks and I say, I'm going to talk to you about a radical monetary experiment. And everybody thinks I'm going to talk about Bitcoin. And I say the radical monetary experiment is that more than 20 central banks have their interest rates at negative. This has never happened before. And they're stuck. They have no way out. So, you know, it's a really interesting space, because the whole thing about currency is that you don't need to know how it works unless it stops working. And when it stops working, everybody needs to know how it works, because your wealth, the future of your children, everything now depends on that. And so country after country after country, people are learning the hard lesson that currency doesn't matter until it does.
Right.
Because it's not working anymore.
And you were just in Buenos Aires. Obviously, Argentina has a long history of sometimes its currency not working.
Right.
Brazil is having a bit of a problem now. Of course, you know, the government going through an impeachment. And I heard you also mention, you know, Britain and Brexit and the pound in that same sentence when you were talking to Rogan. And it shocked me. And then I realized, wait a second, our currency is down, you know, 20% on the year, which for a G7 country is shocking.
Yes, although it's not representing the same problems that you see in places like Brazil or Argentina, or now also Venezuela, Zimbabwe again. These places are suffering, in many cases, from hyperinflation, and they're suffering from an overabundance of debt, where it gets to the point where the interest rate payments on the debt are overwhelming for the budget of the country.
Sure.
So it's not just about repaying the debt. You can't even make payments in the interest. It's like when your credit cards snowball, where the minimum payment on your credit cards is now so big that you're using a credit card to pay the minimum payments on the other credit cards, and that's the last spiral, right?
Right.
Britain isn't really in that place. I think it's more of a short-term shock because of the unexpected outcome of the Brexit vote and uncertainty about how the rules will work once Britain is no longer part of the European Union. So,
right. But it makes people who normally wouldn't even bother understanding what a currency is all about. It's the pound. It's always been there. It's always roughly 1.5 to the dollar. But now when they now go try to buy things, or they're wondering why property values are going down or these things are happening, now they have to look at a hard look in the mirror and start asking themselves, like, what is a currency?
Right.
And then what is Bitcoin, and what are some of these other options?
Right. And, it's as I said, it's a short-term shock of confidence, not a long-term and almost permanent loss in confidence, which is very hard to recover from. Once the people no longer believe that the currency will have value tomorrow because it hasn't, or it's collapsed in the past. Reestablishing that trust is very, very difficult. And you see that in places where that cycle has broken again and again and again. Zimbabwe just started printing its own currency again. For the last 7 years or 8 years, they haven't had their own currency. They trade in foreign currencies because their own collapsed so dramatically. They printed, hundreds, then 1,000 Zimbabwe dollar bills, then 10,000, then 100,000, then 1 million, then 10 million, 1 billion, 10 billion, 1 trillion. When you're printing $1 trillion bill, you have a problem. And then, you get to the point where, and we're seeing this in Venezuela now, where prices double while you're having a beer in the bar, and they say, okay, for the next round, the price is going to be double. And when people stop counting money and start weighing it instead of counting it, so you see people throwing a stack on. I remember in the previous crisis in Zimbabwe, I was watching a BBC documentary. There's a guy pushing a wheelbarrow full of cash, stacks and stacks and stacks of cash. And they asked him, aren't you worried they're going to steal the money that you have in the wheelbarrow? He says, no, I'm worried that they're going to steal the wheelbarrow, which is worth more than the money that's in it. And they also asked him, why don't you burn it? And he said, because goat shit burns better.
These are real currency crises that we should kind of be aware of that are happening.
Right, and this is a recurring theme. So in fact, statistically speaking, national currencies have a shelf life of about 30 years before they collapse in value, because no government can resist the temptation of financing profligacy through printing. And so they print and print and print, and they devalue the currency and inflate it to nothing. And they keep printing, and eventually you have this sudden collapse in confidence, and the currency spikes, the inflation spikes, and the value just drops.
Yeah, and we've seen this happen in Russia as well. It's not just these small countries that we've never heard of. I mean, we've seen currency crashes in a country.
And it's happened. You can list the countries where it hasn't happened. It's a shorter list than the countries where it has happened. So this is the crisis of central banking, and the problem right now is that it's not just that. What's also happening is this competition between nations. So all of these overburdened nations, right, have enormous debt to GDP ratios. They're over-leveraged, and they need to pay off their debt. And in order to do that, the best way to do that is to inflate the currency so that the debt shrinks in terms of its real value, because the currency is worth less, which is a way of stealing from savers. So essentially you're attacking the savings of pensioners and other savers in the economy in a shadow tax through inflation to transfer money to the government. The government doesn't have savings, it has debt, so it doesn't care if the currency is worthless. Savers lose the value of their savings. So it's a wealth transfer. It's transferring from pensioners, really. And this is the crime that's happening in Greece, my home country, to my parents, and in so many other countries. So people who have saved all their life see their savings diminish. Now, in order for this to work, you have to make your own currency worthless, and this is what the governments are trying to do. The problem is, if you make your currency worth less, other countries that have a trade relationship with you, essentially you're exporting the deflation to them. And so they go, oh dear, that's not good for us. Let's make our currency worth less than the other countries. So they start inflating it down. And then you get into this race to the bottom, right? So dollar, yuan, dollar, yuan, dollar, yuan. And they've been trying to do this. Now the dollar is surging, which is the opposite of what the government wants.
Okay. You mentioned Greece, and I think each time, you get asked a lot because you have a
right.
Greek background. What is the situation there as far as their currency, and where do you see ideas where a cryptocurrency might help or not help in a country like that?
It's a humanitarian disaster, is where it is. It's worse this year than it was last year, and it will be worse next year. And it hasn't been solved. It hasn't, 98% of the money that was sent to Greece turned around immediately and went to fund Deutsche Bank and the French banks. So the bailout for Greece was really a bailout for the German and French banks because they could not be allowed to fail. And the situation in Greece is dire, and it's continuing to be dire. There's a lost generation, 18 to 24-year-olds who face 60 to 75% unemployment. Their generation is doomed, really. They have no prospects. And the only thing they can do is leave. So this situation is just getting worse and worse and worse. And this has never happened in peacetime in a European country before, this level of crisis. And the rest of Europe doesn't care.
Wow, it's going to be really fascinating to see how that plays out and how it reverberates across Europe. Before we get down in the nitty-gritty, because you and I always go down the rabbit hole a bit, can we start off for the people that are tuning in that just don't know much at all about Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Or all they know are kind of the seedy stories that sometimes gets bounced around on the internet, and they don't really understand what it is, whether it's old Silk Road stories from years ago, or this or that. For people that maybe are hearing this for the first time, how do you explain Bitcoin?
So Bitcoin is a currency that exists on the internet, that is created on the internet, that really serves the needs of the internet generation. It does not belong to any government. It's not controlled by any bank. Bitcoin isn't a company or product or a service. It's an internet protocol. It's a method of communication, just like we say the web or email, and that doesn't belong to anyone. It's a shared common public good on the internet. Bitcoin is a digital currency and payment system that is a shared good, and it is controlled collectively by the participants in the network. And creating a currency that does not belong to a nation seems weird at first. But then again, we used to have airlines that only existed for one nation and had the flag on the tail, right? Flag carriers, they call them. And phone companies that were monopolies in one nation and had the flag on them. And now that seems absurd. And I think within 20 years, the idea of national currencies as the only option will seem absurd. What Bitcoin is a completely global and open system of money that anyone can participate in without asking permission, without registering for an account or showing ID. All they need to do is download an app. Just like if you want to participate on the web, all you need to do is download a browser. If you want to participate in Bitcoin, all you need to do is download the Bitcoin wallet. And the moment you do so without registering with anyone or creating an account, you can send and receive Bitcoin. And why would you send or receive Bitcoin? Well, for many people who live in Western advanced nations who have debit cards and tap to pay, and it's not really necessary. But in a broader sense, we live in a world that is very fragmented, where money faces borders, very hard borders, strict lines of demarcation between countries and currencies. And you have these national currencies that are badly managed by governments and banks in countries where there is very little difference between a government, a bank, and an organized crime syndicate. All three are the same. The governments are organized crime syndicates.
Zimbabwe,
the banks,
maybe, case in point.
And dozens of countries are like that. Right. And so what happens when they have a crisis is they take the entire population hostage with them. They shut down the borders. They create currency controls. You can't withdraw money from the ATMs. You can't exchange money for another currency. You go with the ship and sink down with it. And what's interesting is that Bitcoin is one of those things that actually offers a safe haven in that particular situation. But it also allows people who have never had a bank account to connect to a global financial system simply by downloading an application on a very, very simple smartphone or even using text messaging. And there's more than 4 billion people who are in that situation. So the vast majority of the human population have not no banking, but very limited banking facilities, single currency with strict conditions on what they can import and export. And Bitcoin bypasses all of that. It gives everybody a currency that is open and global. And so that creates some very interesting conditions in the world. It allows us to create a kind of unified financial system that exists outside of the mandates of government, that is completely private and is very empowering for individuals.
And it scares the hell out of governments and banks.
It scares the hell out of governments that find it peculiar to have people in control of their own money, at which point you should really ask yourself, what kind of government is that doesn't believe in freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of commerce? That's more of an indictment of that kind of government than it is of Bitcoin. If your government is afraid of Bitcoin, you should ask yourself, what kind of government do I have? Most liberal governments are not afraid of Bitcoin. They see it as an opportunity for growth and jobs, and they call the industry fintech, the cornerstone of technology. And in fact, they should see it that way.
Fintech, yeah.
This is one of the things that can compete with banks. And banks really need competition, right? They're way too comfortable with their power and established systems, right?
So we're in probably the global financial center for banking, second or maybe the same as New York City, but we have a lot of international currency trades here in London.
Yes.
We're pretty much in the center of fintech because we're in Shoreditch, which is where technology always started here because of the cheap rents. So I've interviewed countless fintech CEOs in here that are trying to disrupt the pension market, I've had TransferWise in here, their CEOs, trying to disrupt currency exchanges in banks by going peer-to-peer. But the funny thing is that a lot of them stay away from Bitcoin.
Yes.
And at the same time, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, sometimes the banks dip in a little bit. And as I know you've said before, they'll say, oh yeah, well, we don't want to talk about the Bitcoin, but we want to talk about the blockchain. And they kind of, I don't know, maybe choose and pick based on politics or, marketing, or I don't know. What am I seeing flush out in those movements and those ideas?
Well, I think it's important to realize that because Bitcoin is not owned or controlled by anyone, it's not very appealing necessarily to companies that want to carve out a niche in the market and control it. They have to take a much bigger leap of faith. It's a decentralized, very disruptive technology that flies in the face of every regulatory system that exists. And so at the moment, that's a bit outside of the comfort level of most businesses, which is fine by me. Because to the audience that I think we should care about, which is the vast unbanked in the world, the people who suffer under hyperinflated currencies, optimizing the shopping experience or the yields on their pensions is the least of their concerns.
Right. I mean, I live in the Western world, so now I have all these choices when it comes to banking, things I can invest in, services. And so for me, Bitcoin isn't as necessary as some of these other 4 billion people that might not be able to even hold a currency that doesn't inflate by hundreds of % overnight.
Absolutely. And you have the freedom to trade in any currency you want, to trade on any stock exchange in the world you want, and you can do that any time of the day or night you want. And your government is not confiscating your bank accounts, is not setting limits on your ATM withdrawals. But, that may change. It wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibility that you have a currency crisis even in the UK. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. And it's interesting because as an American citizen here, I have some dollar balances and no one wants to touch them here.
Yes.
Because of how hardcore the US tax system is and the IRS when it comes to cracking down on world citizens. So it doesn't even matter that I've filed my taxes every year since I was 12 years old, is that they don't even want to touch it. They're like, American dollars, no thanks. So I'm actually discriminated based on my currency and my citizenship over here. Now, it's a small version of it, but it's a small example that these currencies aren't as fungible as you think they aren't.
Right, so there's two aspects to a currency. There is markets, and then there's politics. And the problem with national currencies is when politics overrides markets. And that's what you're experiencing in a small way is geopolitical considerations overriding market realities. And when that happens, usually that's reflected in the price of the currency. It's reflected in the flexibility and liquidity the currency has. And so one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is that it is completely neutral to geopolitics. It doesn't care. It does not. It's not owned by a nation. And so it has none of the considerations of geopolitics. That becomes more and more important the more geopolitics start affecting markets, right? So if you have, a resurgence of the Cold War, if you have a currency crisis within an economic area like the euro, then having a safe haven, having an exit opportunity is important. It's also important to realize that Bitcoin isn't intended to or designed to, or even I think anybody who's in Bitcoin thinks this will happen. It's not intended to replace national currencies. It's intended to break monopolies. It gives people the option, and it's a completely voluntary system. It gives people the option to have an alternative. So I think of it a bit like exchanging money as a tourist, right? So if you're living in Britain and you want to visit France, you go to France and you change some of your pounds into euros. Great. If you do that often, maybe you keep some of the euros between trips so you can have them for next time when you arrive at the airport. And if you go live in France for a while, maybe you start earning euros directly and you don't exchange as much. Well, I visit the internet as a tourist. So on the internet, I exchange my dollars into Bitcoin because that's the currency I can use to do online shopping in many ways on the internet very effectively, very securely, very fast. So to me, when I visit the internet, the currency of the internet is Bitcoin. Now, after a while, I moved to the internet.
Right.
And I started earning on the internet. And at that point, Bitcoin became the currency I earned in. And now, when I come to the UK, I'm a tourist here, I convert my Bitcoin into pounds in order to spend it here. But I'm still earning in Bitcoin. So if you think of the internet as a foreign country,
okay,
where some of us are permanent residents, right? Then you start understanding how Bitcoin can be a currency of choice for an internet generation.
Okay. And you try to invoice people in Bitcoin. You try to get paid in Bitcoin, and when you can, you try to spend in Bitcoin.
That's correct. Yes, and I actually charge more if you pay me in a national currency. So there's a 20% premium if you try to pay me by wire transfer. And the reason is very simple, because every time I get paid by wire transfer, I have troubles. I have difficulties. The bank loses the wires, they get the wrong information, they send it to the wrong account, it's in the wrong currency, and it takes weeks, and it takes several phone calls. And when I get paid in Bitcoin, it's instantaneous, or near instantaneous. Within 10 to 30 minutes, the funds are cleared in my account, ready to spend, day or night. 24/7, 365. Right. And that's astonishing, the fact that I can invoice someone and it can be the middle of the night on Saturday there, and they can pay me in 15 minutes, done. So because of that experience, I started charging a premium. At first I said 10%, and they found it easier to pay me the extra 10% instead of paying me in Bitcoin. So I'm like, that won't do, so I raised it. And now sometimes it motivates some of my clients to do the hard work to figure out how to get Bitcoin and pay me that way.
It's a great way to encourage them to do that as well. Mm-hmm. So I was at a fintech event about 6 months ago here in London, and I was interviewing Peter Smith, the CEO of blockchain, on the stage.
Yes.
And I know you guys have shared a stage before.
Peter.
Yeah, a few times. And he says that he made a statement of, my mom is never going to use Bitcoin. And I was wondering if you agree with something like that, or do you think we should educate our moms and these people that are obviously not the 4 billion people you're talking about, but some of these other people in these G7 countries, what it is? Do you think, I guess I'm asking you, is my mom ever going to use Bitcoin?
Well, I have an interesting perspective on that. My mom is using Bitcoin. My mom is using Bitcoin to save her pension from the rapacious appetite of an out-of-control Greek government that tried to confiscate 20% of her deposits. And I spent a year begging her to move her money out of the Greek banks because I predicted they were going to collapse. And she did. And I helped her put it into Bitcoin. And then shortly after that, they put currency controls, withdrawal controls, provenance checks, super taxes, extra taxes, emergency taxes, and started taking haircuts off the tops of people's bank accounts. They'll say, if you're really rich, if you have more than 50,000 euros, we'll take a haircut. Well, my mom has her retirement in cash because the only retirement she has is from selling her parents' property. And if she hadn't taken it out, she would have lost 20% of her retirement. At an age where she's disabled, she can no longer go back into the workforce. She no longer has the ability to, especially given the workforce situation in Greece. What are you going to do to that person? What are you going to say to that person? Live 20% less, ma'am, because the Greek government needs to bail out Deutsche Bank. No. So my mom does use Bitcoin because she has to. And so that's the difference in perspective between, I'm really glad that Peter's mom lives in a country where she has the luxury to not need Bitcoin, because there are billions of people out there who do not have that luxury. And they're really the people I think we're paying attention to in the Bitcoin space.
You mentioned Deutsche Bank. When we see a lot of these used to be global banks, when I was in banking, Deutsche Bank was, the creme de la creme, one of the highest credit rating banks, one of the biggest institutions, the JP Morgan of Europe, really. When you see these scandals keep hitting these banks, the HSBCs, we've seen it all before. What do you make of all that?
Banking changed, especially after the 70s, right? It turned into this casino game. Wolf of Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, look at the movies that have come out about that, which give the common man an understanding of what's happening in banking. I worked within banks for many years as a consultant, so I saw it firsthand. Arrogance, narcissism, sociopathy, complete disregard for the rules, complete disregard for common decency. It's not just a matter of being corrupt. It's a matter of being so corrupt that you are willing to sell your own customers junk that you know is junk while shorting that junk through the other trading desk and rig the interest rates and rig the precious metals and rig the markets one after the other. And why? Because they know they will get away with just a slap on the wrist and a fine. And they just incorporate the cost of the fine into their cost of doing business and then leverage up and do it bigger next time because they get bonuses to force them, to push them into taking riskier and riskier and riskier behavior. So, that's the simple truth, right? Even you see recently, we saw Wells Fargo, they discovered the scandal that went back 10 years where the bank was signing up its own customers for credit cards they didn't want because the salespeople were under pressure. They fired people who didn't meet their quotas. They drove them into these corrupt, fraudulent practices. They opened up millions of fraudulent accounts. The CEO walked away with $200 million in bonuses and salaries during the 10-year period because of driving up the stock price. They're not going to go to jail. They actually fired 5,000 of the lowest paid employees in their bank to scapegoat them. And meanwhile, the head of the department walked away with another $150 million bonus, I think. And so the bottom line is the regulatory system in banks is broken. It's completely captured by the banks themselves, and it doesn't serve in any way as consumer protection. And this culture is broken. And the issue isn't just that they're defrauding customers. The issue isn't just that they're gambling. The bigger issue is that the entire financial system is now an extremely fragile, interconnected edifice that is rife with corruption. The whole system is just completely full of corruption. And it's it's at a point where it threatens the stability of the world economy, right? So encouraging these kinds of behaviors or failing to discourage them has led to a system that is now a threat to the global economy.
Okay.
And Bitcoin isn't going to save us, right? It's not. It's not ready. It's not advanced enough. We've got a much bigger problem than any solution we have right now.
Right. And when Trump now takes his Secretary of the Treasury, ex-Goldman Sachs.
Of course.
What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, is anybody surprised? I don't know if anybody actually bought that ridiculous platform.
Of anti-establishment, no
yeah,
more business
anti-establishment,
as
drain the swamp. I mean, come on. Is a billionaire going to be anti-establishment? Let's be serious. Of course he picked Goldman Sachs to run Treasury. How else? And Hillary would have done the same, right? So nothing changes. This is, as I've said many, many times, the election choices facing Americans were a choice between blue Goldman Sachs and red Goldman Sachs. You can choose the color, but Goldman Sachs is still going to be in charge, and if you think your vote is going to make a difference, you're a fool. There are two ways to express power in this world, voice and exit, as my friend Balaji Srinivasan says. And when voice is no longer sufficient, and sometimes even when it is, exit is a more powerful expression. And exit means get your money out of the system, get yourself out of the system, and reduce your exposure to the ridiculous system as much as you can. Bitcoin is a means to switch from expressing power through voice to exit. And I think that's a really powerful way to do it.
Now, does working at Goldman Sachs once in your career make you now not suitable to be Secretary of Treasury? Just to play devil's advocate here, I mean, does it mean that some of the smartest people in banking shouldn't be in that position to know what's up?
But it's not just once. These are consummate careerist bankers who have been in and out of the system at several different stages. He wasn't just a Goldman Sachs banker. You look at the previous parts of the resume, and who are you going to get to drain the swamp? The swamp dwellers? They're not going to do the job, right? And keep in mind, this isn't a matter of evil people doing evil things. This is a matter of systemic corruption, because the system itself is geared towards corrupting those who participate, and corrupts them in very subtle ways. They start believing certain assumptions, right? What's good for Wall Street is good for the broader economy, that without these ways of doing things, we wouldn't be successful, or we wouldn't produce growth, or whatever. So it's not as if bankers are evil. Most of the people who work at banks are really nice people. They're really smart people, and I've worked with many of them, and they're really nice. But if you put them in a system that encourages the worst of human behavior, and that's how you get the bonuses, and that's how you keep your job, people gradually start rationalizing, and they rationalize and rationalize and rationalize and become part of the system. And no better than senior executives or managing directors at Goldman Sachs. I mean, they can't see the forest for the trees.
Right. Yeah, it's been indoctrinated. I know, I grew up in that culture since I was 21, 22. I went to Wall Street, I got handed the phone, and for the next 6 months, I got shown how it was done. Part of that included we try to, rip as much money out of every trade as possible. That's what you try to do. That is the mentality of Wall Street. And maybe any other capitalist system, but there it just can get really out of hand really quickly. And risk-taking as well. I mean, banks started off as institutions to hold deposits.
Right.
And in the 70s, like you said, and 80s, they morphed into these casinos.
Well, it was the Glass-Steagall Act.
Yeah.
It was repealed by Bill Clinton.
Yeah,
and that was the beginning of the end.
Yeah, and that made it even worse. But before that, people were taking these balance sheets and just putting these huge bets, because that just seemed to be the convenient place to do it at the time. Oh, this is the bank, has all these bonds. Well, let's quadruple up and see what happens next. And when I was there, you got paid an annual bonus on how much you made. Now, if you lost a lot of money, you might get sacked, and then you'd go work for Bear Stearns. And then if you made a lot of money, you would get a chunk of it. And so it's in your interest to take a lot of risk.
Right.
And so that's, like you said, the way people grew up.
It's systemic corruption. It's corruption through the system, through a system of perverse incentives. And no one is impervious to that. It's not a matter of individual failing of morality. It's that the system is geared towards producing these outcomes. And as long as you don't change the set of incentives and organizational structure, these are the outcomes that will be produced. And the regulators are part of the same system that produces these outcomes. And nothing changed. The Great Depression of 2008 is still ongoing. And if you want to check with the new Secretary of the Treasury, the first question they should ask them is, how's the economy going? And if they say the economy is growing and improving every day, they are completely out of touch with what's really happening in people's lives. Because the people who elected Trump would say the economy is a complete mess, right? Why? Because there's two economies. There's two economies. There's the economy that the hedge funds live in, because these aren't even banks anymore, they're hedge funds. And then there's the economy that everyday people live in all of the Midwestern states that elected Donald Trump, or that screamed for Brexit, or that are going to maybe elect Marine Le Pen in France, or, these are people who are still suffering 8 years later with enormous increases. They look at the papers, and the papers say, we have no inflation. The inflation rate is low. Really? If you exclude food, energy, and healthcare, and the cost of rent. Are you kidding me? So if you exclude, living, breathing, getting sick, and living somewhere and eating, sure, there's no inflation. But real people, that's 80% of their paycheck, and that's been increasing at double digits. So, this discrepancy between this bubble that the hedge funds live in and the real world is enormous.
Let's talk about Bitcoin and just finish that up. The history of Bitcoin, I think, is important to know kind of where we are now, because we can learn a little bit about it. Walk us through a brief history of Bitcoin. I think it's at $750 today. It's had a nice run this year. Tell us why that matters. And second of all, I want to quote you one time. I think you said this at a Wired Money conference maybe this year or last year, where you said, Bitcoin, it's not slow jazz, it's punk rock, deal with it. As in, it's something that is, I guess, maybe emerging and new, that we're not as familiar, or maybe you can explain exactly what you meant by that.
Well, that was a reference to the banks that are trying to sort of smooth the rough edges off Bitcoin and repackage it as the blockchain. So, Bitcoin is open, borderless, neutral, censorship-resistant, international money that is not subject to banks and governments. And what the banks want is they take one component of that, which is the blockchain technology, and they say, great, can we take this and turn it into a system that is not open, not borderless, not global, not neutral, not censorship-resistant, and completely controlled by banks? No, you can't. And what you want to do is bring in the creative. It's like when they try to do innovation, right? They bring in the creative genius and they say, we love your ideas. We love how independent and creative you are. Now, cut off the ponytail, shave, take off the leather jacket, put on a suit, sit in front of our board, and compromise until you're an empty shell. and then they ask, why is innovation failing within our company? Why? Because you kill it the moment it walks through the door. And this is the same thing with Bitcoin. They want Bitcoin for all of the things, except for all of the things that it is, right? They want blockchain as long as it doesn't do any of the things that the Bitcoin blockchain does, which is empower individuals to get free of the control of banks. And so it's ironic. And that was the essence of my message. Now, in terms of the price and the history of Bitcoin, I think it's really important to not focus on the price itself. The price is important in that it determines the amount of liquidity, the amount of economic activity and investment. Sure, absolutely. And I see a very clear correlation. Every time the price goes up, I sell books, I sell conference engagements, I get more hits on YouTube, all my metrics go up, right? So in some ways, I get kind of whiplashed back and forth because of the price. But the really interesting history of Bitcoin is in the development of the technology. As a technology, Bitcoin has been going through this growth phase very similar to where the internet was in the early 90s. So the core technology maturing, getting more and more robust, getting more and more secure, every attack strengthening the system, recovering from attacks and then getting stronger and more immune to the next attack, and that cycle repeating over 8 years. Something astonishing is happening here. You have a global currency that is not only worth $12 billion in total market now, but has been creating economic activity every 10 minutes, which is the heartbeat of Bitcoin, the blockchain. Every 10 minutes, it has been beating for 8 years nonstop, has not gone down ever in 8 years, has not been stopped in 8 years, and just continues this relentless beat forward. At the same time, the technology itself is evolving so fast. There was recently a developer conference in Milan, and the number of just groundbreaking, disruptive, revolutionary ideas that were presented for the first time. These won't actually reach the end users of Bitcoin for about 2 years. We're now seeing the things that were invented in 2014 are just now hitting the market.
Okay. And the new stuff is impressive.
And it's every 3 months, I am just blown away by some idea that is completely out of this world. Now we're seeing some of the scalability, the early scalability issues being addressed. So if you think of Bitcoin as a network technology, right? It's in a process of permanently failing to scale, just like the internet. So the internet was not quite fast enough to do everybody's email, and then it was. And as soon as it was, people started sending attachments to each other, and then it was like, oh, groaning under the pressure. It can't do all of the attachments, then it can, so people start doing phone calls over the internet, and then it starts groaning again. And this process of constantly failing, because as soon as there's more capacity, people say, oh, wow, hey, now we can do HD video. We couldn't do HD video before. Now we can do 3D video. Now we can do 3D HD holographic video, whatever. There's always a new application. And so the applications always expand to fill the available capacity. And then it starts groaning again for a while, and people optimize it and improve it.
Okay.
And expand the scale. Bitcoin has been going through that same growth process.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
Sinclair Lewis wrote a fantastic book called It Can't Happen Here, about the rise of fascism in developed countries. We're now seeing it all across Europe and, in my opinion, in the United States. That is a potent lesson for people. These are the tools of government. And when you give these tools to government, you have to assume what happens if you have a bad election. We just had one in the US, in my opinion. In fact, either way, the outcome would have put the hands and tools of government in the hands of an authoritarian leader. Trump, Clinton, same thing. And now we have an authoritarian leader who has drone power, torture power, surveillance power. What happens if you have a similar bad election in the UK, where the surveillance powers are 10 times stronger? What happens when France goes down that road? It'll be ironic if in the 21st century, Germany saves the rest of the world from fascism.